So welcome back to this third session on Kamalashila's Stages of Meditation, with a commentary by His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And when I used to write books and articles and things like that, when I was more professorial and a whole lot younger and more energetic and so on and so forth, one of the things I used to do is when I would get a few pages into any project I was working on, I'd go back to where I was and review that before I started writing anything else, so I'd have a sense of continuity. I'm not sure if all writers do that, but that was the way that I worked. So I do the same thing with these recordings. After the recording is posted to YouTube, I will go back to that recording and I'll watch it and I'll listen to it. And then I'll start thinking about what I want to do in the subsequent week. And that's the way that I will have continuity. Otherwise, what would happen is, Thursday, Friday, Saturday would roll around. I would totally forget what I had said the previous Saturday, and I would not be able to have that continuity. So that's what I did after last week's recording. And I felt that what I had talked about with the meditation process that I ended up with, which is a little bit of a personal meditation process that I shared with everyone, I felt like it wasn't as clear as I wanted it to be. It may not have been clear to some people at all, or it may have been clear to some people, I'm not sure. But it didn't meet it was not up to my standards. I wasn't satisfied with it. So I thought a lot about that and what was the issue. And I realized that in my mind, I had a certain context or a certain framework for doing that meditation, which was implicit in what I talked about, implicit in the sense that I was sharing something within the context of Kamalashila / Dalai Lama's teachings, but that context was sort of more implicit for me, but it might not have been clear to anybody else, and therefore what I was saying may not have been as clear as I wanted. So I spent the week going back into Kamalashila and looking for what that context would be, more like the philosophical context that would explain that practice. So that's what I want to talk about this week. And then I'm going to end with a quotation from a really interesting book that I've been reading, perhaps coincidentally. Ouch. Oops. Just whacked one of those places where hello, Anil. Just whacked one of those places where I sliced myself up when I fell off the ladder yesterday. I guess you can't really see this very well. This is called Atisha Dipankara, Illuminator of the Awakened Mind, translated by James Apple. And it's a biography of Atisha, and it also contains a number of his writings. And I've always been a fan of Atisha's, always. Well, since I was a graduate student, I was a fan of Atisha's. And he was very important in the transmission of Buddhism to Tibet in its second iteration, second transmission, as it's called. So Kamalashila is important in the first transmission, and Atisha is important in the second transmission. So there's sort of a linkage there. But I don't think that's the reason why something popped out of the Atisha biography that I thought was very useful for what we'll be talking about tonight. So that's where we'll end. So there's a sort of framework for you. So let me start with a quotation from Stages of Meditation, the Kamalashila book. I have the wrong glasses on. You get old enough and you need glasses for the computer, you need glasses for the textbook, you need glasses for driving down the street, etc. At least we have glasses, even though getting old kind of sucks. Kamalashila, page 126. This is in his Holiness's commentary. He says, the great Kamalashila, a renowned student of the esteemed Shantarakshita, who's really responsible for creating monasticism and the lineages, the old lineages of the Dharma in Tibet. A renowned student of the esteemed Shantarakshita, belonged to the Yogacara Svatantrika Madhyamika school of thought. I'll talk more about this later, but it's important. This school asserted two levels of the selflessness of phenomena, subtle and gross. The non-duality of subject and object, or perceiver and perceived, is the gross level of suchness, while seeing all phenomena as empty of true existence is the subtle level of suchness. So what's meant by this is that there's a distinction between the views of, say, the Dalai Lama, which belongs to the Prasangika Madhyamaka school, and this school, which is a Yogacara school or a Yogacara interacting with or connected with Madhyamaka. Now, here's the reason that this is important, is this distinction that's being drawn here between the two levels of the selflessness of phenomena, or we could say the emptiness of phenomena. So His Holiness is saying there's a difference between the gross level of selflessness of phenomena or emptiness of phenomena and the subtle level. And when I was talking about the meditation practice last week of recognizing that everything that's going on around you as you're meditating is a phenomenon really of your own mind, of the or in a certain way to say the relationship of your mind and the objective things that are going on around you. That's what he's describing as the coarse level of emptiness or the coarse selflessness. Let me delve into this a little bit farther. I think many people recognize that what we perceive as being external reality is really something that's being constructed in our own consciousness, that we don't really experience external reality directly, that is mediated through our sense organs, and that our brain in some way or our mind in some way pulls all that sense organ information together with our thoughts and our understandings about things from the past, and then we create a representation of the reality that we're in. And it works very well. I mean, that representation works well enough for us to send rockets to the moon, to drive down the street, to live our lives, and so on and so forth. But it's not a full representation of what's actually going on in the material world. We know that. I mean, in the simplest sense, if you've ever had a dog whistle, dogs hear sounds that we can't hear. You blow on a dog whistle, you don't hear anything, but Rover does, right? And there are other examples of this. We don't see ultraviolet light unless we have a special camera. Ultraviolet light is there, and that's a certain type of perception of reality. So I think that this concept first entered the West with Schopenhauer, who, by the way, was influenced by Indian thought, South Indian thought, as it was available to him in the early 19th century. But he had this idea that the world's a representation, and that idea floated a lot through Western thought. So it is there in Buddhism. It's not the way they talk about it exactly, but in Western language, that's the best way to talk about it. The world's a representation, and that representation is something that's created in our own consciousness. So in that respect, oh, that's your cat. I thought that was my cat. I'm sorry. So in our consciousness, what's happening is the appearance of outer reality is actually happening with our own mind. But it really is only an appearance, but we don't really keep that in mind. We just take it as it's out there. But if you're meditating, you can think about this, or you can notice this, that really it is your own mind, which is not to say there's nothing out there. This isn't total idealism. But what we're experiencing is our own consciousness. And this is what is being described as the gross level of the selflessness of phenomena, or the emptiness of phenomena. Okay. So that gross level is what I was talking about last week, as sort of a practical way to deal with all this stuff that goes on around us disturbing your meditation, is to observe it with the recognition that ultimately what you're experiencing is your own mind. So whether it's a cat meowing or a dog barking is still registering in my consciousness, and it's my consciousness. And that the meowing cat, but the bark is okay, but the barking dog is not okay, is something about the way in which I am relating to aspects of my own consciousness, that I've made a decision that the barking dog is not okay. My neighbors have said they don't mind the barking dog. Their dog barks, they don't mind, it's their dog. Now, that's their decision. So in their consciousness, that barking isn't a problem. So you see what I'm saying? That there's a problem in our experience is our choice through our habit patterns, our decisions, and so on and so forth. So we can recognize that in the meditation process. So that's what I was getting at. However, in this school of thought, of the Yogacara Svatantrika Madhyamaka school of thought, there's a coarse and a subtle level of consciousness. So, I don't want to get into the ins and outs of these philosophies. It's not really appropriate for this kind of class. And quite honestly, a lot of it eludes me. His Holiness goes on to say that although he himself does not follow this school of thought, and the way he teaches does not usually follow this school of thought, but follows the Prasangika Madhyamika school of thought, for the sake of explanation in this book, he's going to adhere to Kamalashila's view. And the reason he can do this is the way the Tibetan monastic education process works, is that you start with what are considered lower schools of philosophy, and you work your way up to higher schools of philosophy, and you master the tenets of each school, and then you start studying the next level up, which refutes the tenets of the level down below. But you understand all of them, so you can use all of them, practically speaking. And in fact, I do recall someplace His Holiness having written that the fundamental psychology, or the best psychology for understanding Tantra, is the Chittamatra psychology, not the Prasangika psychology. So these people are able to adopt different philosophical views as they are useful for different purposes, which is, I think, quite an accomplishment. Okay. So what is the subtle level of suchness or emptiness? So His Holiness says, seeing all phenomena as empty of true existence is the subtle level of suchness. Seeing all phenomena as empty of inherent existence is the subtle level of suchness, which to me is identical with Prasangika Madhyamika, so I'm not really sure what the conflict is. But seeing the subtle level of suchness requires deep meditative equipoise. It's not the sort of thing that you're going to experience if you're sitting on the meditation cushion and you're hearing dogs barking and they're bothering you. You have to be into deep one-pointedness of attention, shamatha, complete settled focusedness. And when you're in that state, barking dogs are not something that you're going to notice. Now, if you recall the talk that I did on the Heart Sutra several months ago, there was a lot of talking about what does it mean to say that there is no form, there is no this, there is no that, there is no other thing. His Holiness's explanation for what the Heart Sutra was saying is not so much that the Heart Sutra is saying forms don't exist, sense experience doesn't exist, the world doesn't exist, but rather that in a deep state of meditation, of shamatha, one-pointedness on some phenomenon, some object, when you're in that state, nothing else exists. So when you're in that state, you don't experience your body, which is form. It's not that form doesn't exist or the body doesn't exist. It's just when you're in that state of awareness, you're not experiencing it. In the old days, that used to be called trance. The early Buddhist translators called that trance, which is generally a bad word for what's being experienced, because trance implies unconsciousness, at least in English, right? But in a sense, it does convey something that's sort of useful, right? So that's the distinction between coarse and subtle levels of understanding emptiness. Why does that matter? Well, one of the things I've been emphasizing in this series of talks is the difference between how do we as lay people practice, as ordinary folks, how do we practice versus how do the great yogis practice? So this kind of book, right, Kamalashila, is writing for monks who have the ability to develop shamatha, or maybe have developed shamatha, or could develop it, because they can devote themselves to this practice. For the rest of us who lives lives in the world, who have to go to work, who have family responsibilities, or just basically have minds that are barely capable of that level of concentration, like mine, right? Then how could we practice? Well, we can practice with understanding, developing an understanding of the coarse level, if not the subtle level. So this is, well, there are many ways in which the teachers have talked about people of different capacities. Sometimes they talk about people of great capacity, middling capacity, and lesser capacity. And you find that in the stages of the path, the long rim. I always consider myself a person of the lower capacity. So then how could I practice? Well, this is a way to practice so that you can understand emptiness intellectually, and you can use that intellectual understanding of emptiness in your practice without having shamatha. And so you can still develop as a person. You can still fulfill your bodhisattva vows of cultivating yourself and moving forward, and understanding that the practice that you're doing is done with a bodhisattva motivation. And even if you're not having great experiences and nowhere close to experiencing shamatha, that doesn't mean you don't have a valuable practice. And so that's what, in a sense, is implied in what Kamalashila is saying here. Okay, Kamalashila, so what I just presented was His Holiness's way of describing this. If we turn to something Kamalashila himself has said, now I'm on page 129. In the middle of his passage, as translated here, he says, again, this is Kamalashila, the physical aspects of the aggregates, sources of perception and elements. So this is the basic psychological analysis of the mind in the Abhidharma. The physical aspects of the aggregates, the sources of perception, that's the objects, and the elements, are in the ultimate sense nothing other than aspects of the mind. And again, this could be taken as philosophical idealism, but that's not what he's saying, right? Kamalashila is saying, because in my language, we're creating a representation of the world, not experiencing it directly, therefore, everything that we're experiencing is nothing other than the mind. Essentially, the mind is the context, the framework, the matrix, if you like, in which all these experiences are happening. Again, His Holiness on the bottom of the page reiterates, the object perceived does not have an identity separate from the mind that perceives it. So this is the coarse level of emptiness as understood in the Yogacara Svatantrika Madhyamika school. Did I get that right? I did. Yogacara Svatantrika Madhyamika school. Okay. So I've said enough about that. Let's move on, unless there's a quote here that's okay. Page 130, His Holiness writes, this view of the Chittamatra or mind-only school, which I just got through describing, is very similar to the contention of the yoga, All right, so this view is not acceptable to the later Madhyamika schools. Because as he points out, in an ultimate sense, the mind also is not real. And when he says the mind also is not real, and this is a quotation from Kamalashila, when he says the mind also is not real, he means, ultimately speaking, the mind is not real. It lacks inherent existence. It lacks substantiality. It lacks autonomy, all the usual ways in which we understand things to be empty. The mind is also empty of those characteristics also. And because the mind is empty of those characteristics, it is without inherent existence. It's empty, okay? So in that sense, he says the mind is not real. But when he says the mind is not real, he means it's not real in the sense that it doesn't have the substantiality and whatnot that we impute to it, okay? So Kamalashila ends this passage by saying, therefore, the mind by nature is like an illusion. The mind by nature is like an illusion, which is to say that we experience it one way, but it really is quite different. We experience the appearance of mind or consciousness as if it's a thing with continuity, unbroken, autonomous, single, and all this sort of stuff. But essentially, it doesn't have those characteristics. That's why it's unreal and it's illusion-like. Now, the Buddhists here are making an important distinction from sort of their Hindu compatriots. In Vedanta, for example, it would be said that the mind is an illusion, not that the mind is illusion-like or like an illusion, but is actually an illusion. Okay, only God is real and everything else is an illusion. The Buddhists are not buying that. They're saying conventional reality is illusion-like, and there's a difference between it is an illusion and it is like an illusion. And it's very important to keep this in mind, because if you don't keep this in mind, the whole basis of Buddhist morality disappears. I'm not going to go too deeply into that, but I'll just say that if you don't keep this in mind, the whole basis for Buddhist morality disappears. So illusion-like, not an illusion. Now, according to the Madhyamika school, going farther down this page, every phenomenon is a mere label imputed by the mind. It is not only external existence, but the mind that perceives the various categories of false phenomena that is devoid of true existence. And then to Kamalashila, analyze that just like the mind, the nature of all phenomena too is like an illusion. So this is the place where there's this kind of a transition to this Madhyamaka view. And I don't get the distinction, frankly, because if you're meditating the coarse level of the emptiness of phenomena, you're understanding that they are lacking inherent existence, that they're illusion-like, and that what you're perceiving is not different from your mind, but also that what you're perceiving as having any kind of characteristics at all are created by your own mind, imputing those characteristics onto what's going on in your mind. So that's the place where I don't draw, I find it hard to draw a distinction, right? So if I'm listening to the dog barking when I'm meditating and it's bothering me, okay, first off, the barking is something that is created in my own mind. It is my own mind because it's my own consciousness. And that it bothers me is my imputing botheredness onto the barking. And the meaning barking, which is that I know it's a dog and not a coyote or a kitty, is my mind imputing characteristics onto that experience. So these things all merge together. So in my sense, this is where these different schools merge in our own meditative practice or in our own experience. It doesn't even have to be a meditative practice. Now then, if we jump to page 133, His Holiness is making a special point, which is a cautionary point, a very special cautionary point. So we've been talking about coarse level of suchness or emptiness, and there's also a subtle level of emptiness. It's easy to fall into the idea that emptiness or voidness is another thing, because our minds are so programmed into finding things and reifying ideas into things that we can easily take emptiness to be yet another thing, okay? So within the notion of ultimate reality, things are devoid of true existence. They lack inherent existence. In the same way, suchness, which is an attribute of phenomena, which is to say the emptiness phenomena, is also devoid of true existence. This is important. These are His Holiness's words, not mine. Even when we understand that phenomena like physical form and so forth are devoid of true existence, there is a danger of thinking that ultimate reality may have true existence. Even ultimate reality does not have true existence. Everything is empty. All phenomena are empty. Right? All phenomena are empty. Okay, now, onward. In the beginning of the book, Kamalashila says that the foundation of all practice, the foundation of all Buddhism is compassion. And the basis for achieving compassion is to gain equanimity. And he defines compassion as the desire to remove suffering from all beings, to eliminate suffering from the experience of all beings. Loving kindness is the desire or the concern to benefit all beings, to create happiness for all beings. And all of this stuff fits within the framework of the concept of bodhicitta, the practice of bodhicitta. In a number of places, His Holiness says that many Buddhist practices look just like practices in other religions. But what differentiates the Buddhist practices from the practices in other religions is bodhicitta, the intention to develop oneself to become a Buddha, ultimately, in order to benefit other beings, not simply to achieve self-liberation. And in fact, in a place that I'm probably not going to be able to find here in Kamalashila, he points out, His Holiness points out, that even among the Buddhists, some of the other schools, which could be called lower schools, for example, the Theravada schools or the Hinayana schools, if you like that language, they're seeking liberation, they're seeking nirvana. But the bodhisattva, being on the bodhisattva path, the being that's motivated by bodhicitta, is not seeking nirvana. The bodhisattva is avoiding what's considered the extreme of peace, which is nirvana, so as to have both feet, as it were, in the world of conventional and ultimate reality to benefit beings that are caught in the ordinary world. If you're in the solitary peace of nirvana, you're not experiencing the ordinary world and the beings in it, and you're not going to have great concern for them. So the true middle way of neither being caught in the material world nor caught or stuck in nirvana is this middle path, which is the bodhisattva path. And that's the intention, that's practicing with a certain intention and a motivation. It's not necessarily being a semi-enlightened being, but practicing from a certain point of view. Now, I have to confess that nirvana sounds pretty good. And if I had the opportunity, I'd probably settle into it. So I'm not a very good bodhisattva, but anyhow, that's the distinction. So let me turn now to what Kamalashila has to say about bodhicitta, because he could certainly do a better job of it than I can. And just as we talked about selflessness or emptiness as having coarse and subtle levels, Kamalashila talks about bodhicitta as having coarse and subtle levels. Here on page 67, the passage from Bodhicitta, after he talks about meditation on loving kindness, and this is after he's talked about meditation on compassion, he's going on to talk about bodhicitta. He says, therefore, having familiarized yourself with compassion as the basis, meditate on the awakening mind of bodhicitta. Bodhicitta is of two types, conventional and ultimate. You've heard this sort of thing before. Conventional bodhicitta is the cultivation of the initial thought that aspires to attain unsurpassable and perfectly consummated Buddhahood in order to benefit all wandering beings. So when we take the bodhisattva vows, say, before an initiation or any other practice we're doing, we're taking vows of conventional bodhicitta because we're not highly elevated beings, we're not Aryas, okay? But we're still taking bodhisattva vows, which means we're bodhisattvas. As I've heard one person phrase it, we're baby bodhisattvas. And that sounds pretty good. We're baby bodhisattvas when we take the vows, and we're practicing conventional bodhicitta. But I got very interested in this distinction between conventional and ultimate bodhicitta. And so I want to sort of talk about that a bit. So let's go to page 78. Kamalashila tells us the ultimate bodhicitta is transcendental and free from all elaborations. Okay. Now, His Holiness is going to explain that. And when he talks about elaborations, he's talking about the thoughts that we have in our minds, which are defining or clarifying the reality that we experience. Okay. Elaborations are understanding that a bark comes from a dog and a meow comes from a cat. That's an elaboration of the mind, which is imputed on or projected onto those raw sounds, which in themselves don't have any meaning. You know, when a baby hears a bark and has never met a dog, what is that? It's just a sound. It has no meaning. But once the baby's had the opportunity to play with the dog and he hears a bark, now that baby's mind begins to elaborate that that being, you may not know the word dog, but that being is associated with that sound. And then later on, he learns the word dog, or she learns the word dog. I don't want to be sexist. We don't have a good English language for non-gender based. We don't have a good non-gender based English language is what I'm trying to say. Okay. So she or he now associates that sound, that being with the word dog. That's an elaboration. Okay. And those elaborations, by the way, ultimately become a problem for us because that's what creates all our confusion about the nature of things that are going on. Which is not to say, by the way, that babies are enlightened. Although, I don't know, maybe they are. But anyway, in the Buddhist sense, they're not because they have predispositions. Okay. Here's His Holiness's explanation of that line, which I'll go back to. The ultimate bodhicitta is transcendental and free from all elaborations. His Holiness says, all the specific levels of an ordinary being, that's us, are known as mundane. And all the spiritual levels of a superior being, or Arya, are known as transcendental or supermundane, or supramundane. You achieve the transcendental level when you achieve the path of seeing for the first time. So what's being said here is that in order to be practicing ultimate bodhicitta, you have to achieve the path of seeing. So what does this mean? So there are 5 paths or 5 levels of development of our consciousness, of which the third is the path of seeing. And what that means is when you're on the path of seeing, when you have experienced the emptiness of phenomena directly, not intellectually, but directly experience the emptiness of phenomena, you're on the path of seeing. And at that point, you're an Arya, the superior being. Okay. That's what the path of seeing is. And at that point, you can practice ultimate bodhicitta. Now, this generates for me what I consider a little bit of a mystery. When you're on the path of seeing, when you can experience the emptiness of phenomena directly, how do you practice bodhicitta? Because if you're experiencing the emptiness of phenomena, there's nothing there. There's no phenomenon there, at least in the meditative state. In the non-meditative state, when you get off the meditation cushion, you experience phenomena again. But when you're on the meditation cushion, what do you experience? Now, I'm nowhere near the path of seeing, so I can only make some understanding assumptions, as it were, based upon what I've read, what I've been taught. But to me, there's a mystery here. Now, if we go back to the teachings about the dying process, which I discussed in another class, we know that in the dying process, there's a certain stage you get to where the wind element has dissolved in the consciousness element. And as the consciousness element begins to dissolve into the white light, all conceptuality has ended. So you have experiences at that point, but no concepts. It seems to me that that must be similar to the path of seeing. You're having experiences, but no concepts. So if you're not having concepts, how are you practicing bodhicitta? How are you practicing a desire to alleviate suffering of all beings and bring happiness to all beings if you don't experience beings? If you turn to something like the 8,000 line Perfection of Wisdom, which is really the great holy text, the text, if you will, of the Perfection of Wisdom, there are passages in the 8,000 line Perfection of Wisdom where the Buddha says that bodhisattvas are bodhisattvas precisely because in their intention to save all beings, they do not experience any beings. They're bodhisattvas precisely because they don't experience beings. That's their level of consciousness, right? So it's a mystery how you can practice that. I mean, you can have the intention, but what's happening in your experience? Well, it's a mystery. Can we know? We can't know because there's no thought going on at that time. Even if we knew, we couldn't really talk about it very well. And maybe that's one of the reasons why there's so much paradoxical thought or paradoxical talking about these things. So I don't know, maybe that's heretical to say that we can't know. We can't talk about these things. We can't really know these things.
I love it. That's wonderful.
On page 79, His Holiness writes, this ultimate bodhicitta is also said to be free of all elaborations, particularly in the context of the various categories of emptiness, such as the 16 emptinesses, etc. So that's what he's saying. Free of all elaborations. Concepts cannot grasp what this is. So that means we ordinary people who live by the conceptual consciousness can't understand this ultimately, or well, not just ultimately. We can't understand it, period, with this level of mind, which is kind of frustrating because we want to, and because so much Buddhist scripture talks about these things, right? And we want to understand it. We can drive ourselves crazy trying to understand this stuff. It's easier to realize that we can't understand it. I have a friend here in Santa Fe. His name's Fred. I won't give his last name. Fred is a theoretical physicist. He's a Harvard University PhD, physical, theoretical physicist who spent his life, mostly of his life, working at Los Alamos and working on complexity theory and stuff like that. So we have these conversations. And Fred always gets me to this place of saying, don't know. It's a mystery. We can't know. So here I'm talking about this to this theoretical physicist, right, who lives in the world of equations and complexity theory and thinks in ways I can't think about, things I can't even think about. But when we're talking about this stuff, he says, no, the mind can't go there. And he's okay with that, which kind of astounds me. Now, he's a very deep Buddhist practitioner. That's one of the reasons he doesn't have any problem with this. And then our conversation ends up in the same place. He says, it's all a matter of the blessings of the lineage masters. He's a great tantrika. In the end, although we can't understand it, we can experience it due to the blessings of our teachers, the great lineage holders of the tradition. But this isn't really about Tantra, so I'm not going to go down that line. That's just an aside, but I love it. I love the way he just comes to that place. And he's even more intellectual than I am, which is, I think, saying a bit. Okay. page 80, still His Holiness here. Ultimate reality or ultimate bodhicitta. So His Holiness is talking about this space that I find incomprehensible. It's obviously not incomprehensible to him. Ultimate reality or ultimate bodhicitta is described as extremely clear. It is referred to as ultimate because it is the object of engagement of an ultimate wisdom. It is also called stainless and unwavering. In other words, the wisdom of a superior being, or an Arya, we talked about that earlier, someone on the path of seeing. The wisdom of a superior being in meditative absorption, shamatha, is a wisdom that is a combination of a calmly abiding mind and special insight. Okay, the wisdom of a superior being combines shamatha and vipassana, and the wisdom arises, actual wisdom arises out of a combination of shamatha and vipassana. That is to say, a concentrated mind which can observe phenomena from the path of seeing, non-conceptually observe the actual nature of phenomena. That's what a wise mind is. This is the definition of wisdom now that we have in Kamalashila. Such a combination is achieved by first achieving calm abiding. Once you gain stability with regard to the object of investigation, you can focus your understanding upon it without being disturbed by the mental laxity and excitement of conceptual thoughts, right? Because you're past conceptual thoughts. Such wisdom is referred to as unwavering and is compared to a butter lamp undisturbed by the breeze. So that's nice. Maybe some of us can attain that, maybe not, but that's a great goal. So what are goals useful for? Why are we doing what we're doing? Well, in the Buddhist context, if you can't achieve shamatha in this life, you develop the habit patterns or the seeds or the kleshas, if you will. Maybe that's not the best word because it usually means stains, but you develop the habit patterns for cultivating higher levels of consciousness in the future life. Or if you don't like that idea, then, okay, so now I'm 60, let's say, and I'm bothered by conceptual thoughts and I'm bugged by my history and past. I'm trying to meditate and all these thoughts are always assaulting me. But if I work at it and if I practice, then maybe by the time I'm 70, I'm less bugged. And by the time I'm 80, I'm even less bugged because it is a developmental process. And in this context, you could say, well, what else is there to do? Sit around and read the newspaper? I mean, what else are we going to do with our lives besides cultivate ourselves? I mean, anybody who's attending this class is obviously not satisfied with that level of existence, right? So what are we satisfied with? We're satisfied with exploring our inner natures and cultivating our natures in one way or another. So this is the path. This is what we're talking about, trying to achieve this wisdom. And if we can't achieve it at the level of the path of seeing, we can understand it in the coarse intellectual level. And that's still beneficial because that's the coarse understanding of suchness, the coarse understanding of emptiness. And that's still beneficial because when we have the coarse level of the understanding of things, we still have the opportunity to make beneficial choices for ourselves. We can recognize things for what they are, even on the mundane level. And we can develop meaning, which in itself I consider quite valuable. Okay, where was I now? On the page, okay. So he's talked about shamatha, calmly abiding mind. And here he writes, His Holiness writes, special insight refers to gaining special insight into the ultimate reality of the object on which your mind is focused. So special insight Vipassana is seeing things for what they actually are. Right. Now, I want to turn to, at this point, I want to turn to a passage from this book on Atisha, because this is the way I want to finish my thoughts on Bodhichitta. And this has to do with how we as ordinary people can practice. So we know that ultimate bodhicitta is this combination of shamatha vipassana, calm your body and mind, special insight, seeing into the nature of reality as it actually is non-conceptually. But for the rest of us who live with conceptual minds, let me read this passage. Now, this is the author, James Apple, in this book, Atisha Tapamkara, Illuminator of the Awakened Mind, which was actually just published a couple years ago, I think 2019. Yeah, 2019. This is a comment that Apple is making as a preliminary to a passage from Atisha, which I'll read. So let's start with his comment. Apple says, the ultimate awakening mind, the birthless, luminous, non-conceptual realm of reality, equated with emptiness, is cultivated during meditative equipoise, shamatha. The conventional awakening mind is cultivated during post-meditative practices, right? So what he's saying is the ultimate bodhicitta is practiced when you're in meditative practice, when you're sitting on the cushion with shamatha, and then conventional awakening mind is practiced when you're off the meditation cushion. On the meditation cushion, practice experience of things as they are. Off the cushion, experience things as illusion-like. So conventional bodhicitta is bodhicitta oriented toward the illusion-like nature of experience, experiencing other folks as folks, people as people. Did you have a question, Lynn? Oh, no, okay. In this program of training, the two levels of the awakening mind are integrated and stabilized, having the essence of emptiness and compassion. A snapshot of instructions for this integrated cultivation is found in the open basket of jewels. This is a text written by Atisha. And here is what Atisha says regarding this training. Regarding the training, first, the mind did not come from anywhere and will not go anywhere at the end. So this is reality, ultimately speaking. This is like the reality that the Heart Sutra speaks of, the reality that's understood by the Bodhisattva in meditative equipoise. The mind does not abide anywhere and is without color or without shape. By the way, that's why it's hard to find your own mind. Back to Atisha. The mind does not arise from the beginning, nor does it cease at the end. The mind is empty of inherent existence and has the nature of clear light. So we know about clear light because we talked about it with the tantric practice and the practices of preparation for death. Clear light comes at the moment of death, or can be achieved through highest yoga tantra. The mind is empty of inherent existence and has the nature of clear light. One should recall this again and again. So he's not specific about whether you try and recall this during ordinary experience in the post-meditative state or when you're meditating. Maybe he means both. Then he says, on the other hand, one should stabilize through accustoming the awakening mind to love and compassion. one should completely purify the mind and stand firm, being continuously mindful of each moment of thought with mindfulness, awareness, thoughtfulness, and conscientiousness. So here he is being specific. What he's saying is, when you're off the meditation cushion, you practice conventional bodhicitta, loving kindness and compassion. That stabilizes the mind. It creates good habit patterns. That's something any of us can do at any time. And then when you're on the meditation cushion and you're trying to achieve single-pointed concentration or shamatha, you will experience your abilities strengthened by virtue of having practiced the conventional bodhicitta. So the conventional bodhicitta of ordinary daily life strengthens and supports your ability to practice the ultimate bodhicitta, which is achieving a state of the understanding and experiencing the emptiness of phenomena. So then this gets back to the question of the mystery for me. And so now I'm off text in saying this. Perhaps it's the case that though in an ultimate sense there is no experience of phenomena in meditative equipoise, in the way in which the Heart Sutra talks about there is no this, no that, no the other thing, no form, no sound, no beginning, no ending, so on and so forth. It's the practices in the conventional reality of the world that make those other practices possible. It's the habit patterns. So even if you're not thinking about there being beings, because you're not experiencing beings, you have the habit of going through your existence with a concern for all that exists, a very deep and sensitive and engaged level, without even having to think about it, without being able to think about it. So within the context of mystery and not understanding, the habits take over. One of the questions that came up in one of the classes I was teaching, I don't remember which, is in the dying process, how do you discriminate? How do you remember to focus on the clear light? Because you can't think. If you can't think, how can you think to yourself, okay, now I've experienced red increase. So soon will come black light and then the clear light. Well, you can't have that thought. So how is it possible for these things to happen, to be focused on the clear light, these higher levels of consciousness? Habit. We have the habit of that focus without even thinking about it. We have the habit of it. And we develop the habit in the context and in the practice of ordinary life, in the illusion-like life that we have. So there's the value. That shows the value of daily life. And as Atisha has said, or the value of practice in daily life, and as Atisha has said, be continuously mindful of each moment of thought with mindfulness, awareness, thoughtfulness, and conscientiousness. So he's urging us moment by moment to practice. Practice what? Bodhicitta. Practice mindfulness, concern for others, laying down these positive habit patterns, having the thought all phenomena are empty. They lack inherent existence. My first Lama, and I talked about him, my first Lama was Tara Tulku. He was the retired abbot of Utah Tantric College at the time. And sometimes we'd go for walks, and every once in a while, he'd snap his fingers. And then a couple of minutes would go past and he'd snap his fingers again. And I saw this going on for quite a while. And at one point I said, Rinpoche, why are you snapping your fingers? And he said, to remind myself of the emptiness. So moment by moment, okay. Remember, all phenomena are empty of inherent existence. They are not what they appear. And then as his attention on that and recollection of that would fade, he had this habit of snapping his fingers, which would remind him, all phenomena are empty. And so moment by moment, day by day, he was constantly practicing in that way. And that's what Atisha is urging us to do. Okay. So that's where I want to end things tonight. And hopefully that clarifies some of the possible muddle that I made last week without making things too complicated. But focusing on this distinction between the conventional and the ultimate, what we ordinary beings can do and what we can aspire toward. So a way to find meaning in our daily lives through this practice. And what I'm going to do next week is then turn to Kamalashila's cautionary comments about the distinction between the Zen view of practice and Kamalashila's view of practice, which became predominant in Tibet. This distinction between gradual achievement of enlightenment and what the Zen practitioners call instantaneous enlightenment. So he has some very useful comments to make, which are relevant to us, and especially relevant to those of us who practiced Zen, as I have. And he's very kind-hearted and subtle in the way he makes these comments. He doesn't come out and say, this is right, this is wrong, but he focuses on where some problems might be. And again, as I said before, I am not knocking Zen. There are some limitations the way some people understand Zen, but there are great enlightened Zen masters too. And they're great practitioners of Zen in our midst. There are a number of them here in Santa Fe, by the way. I'll speak about that next week. So that's where I'll end things.